Welcome back to Adventures in Theater History. Here on this show, we bring you the best stories from the deep and fascinating history of theater in the city of Philadelphia. I'm your host, Peter Schmitz. Our original music for this podcast, including this new theme for our Season 3, is composed by Christopher Mark Colucci. Thank you, Chris. That was a very exciting and appropriate fanfare because this is the first episode of our new series of adventures, which we are calling the Tryout Town. To celebrate the significance of this marvelous occasion, we're going to start the premiere episode with a bit of a treat for you. We have an audio selection from the 1933 movie 42nd Street. Now, for those of you who are theater nerds or classic Hollywood movie buffs or are disturbingly knowledgeable about American musical theater history, and I must admit I fall somewhere into all three of those camps, this scene is very familiar, but I am amazed that more people do not know this film, because you really should. It's fascinating and delightful and horrifying all at the same time. As the New Yorker magazine film critic and historian Richard Brody described the film's significance in an article in 2020, quote, 42nd Street rescued the musical genre, which had been done to death in the early days of talking pictures. With 3 spectacular production numbers, the film captured the first full flowering of Busby Berkeley's geometrical and symbolic and macabre and erotic imagination. But for the bulk of the movie, 42nd Street is a dramatic comedy of backstage life, chronicling the making of a Broadway musical called Pretty Lady. Now, to quickly summarize the plot of the movie, it goes like this. A pair of scrappy Broadway producers somehow get the money to hire the visionary but rather tyrannical director Julian Marsh, who is played in the movie by Warner Baxter, to stage their show. With the help of a talented but wolfish dance director named Andy Lee, who is rather reminiscent of the real-life Busby Berkeley, really, he assembles a chorus that includes the naive young newcomer and top-flight tap dancer Peggy Sawyer, which is played by Ruby Keeler in her first big role. But when the Broadway grande dame Dorothy Brock breaks an ankle the night before the opening, Peggy is plucked from the chorus and thrust into the lead role, and her triumph marks the show as a hit. Ginger Rogers, Una Merkel, and Dick Powell all have important parts in it too. The movie 42nd Street is now in the public domain, thank goodness, and if you don't want to wait for it to come up on your TCM playlist, you can easily watch it online. I'll put a link in the show notes. I'm going to play you now just a minute-long clip from a very specific scene in the movie. It happens just after the dress rehearsal in New York, which has gone terribly. And the director, Julian Marsh, is yelling in frustration at the entire company, who have all been gathered by the stage manager and who are lined up on the stage in front of him. Una Merkel and Ginger Rogers are standing next to each other, gossiping, and the leading lady, Dorothy Brock, played by B.B. Daniels, is looking very concerned.
And is this what you call a finale? What is this, amateur night? Have we been rehearsing for 5 weeks, or did I dream it? May I remind all you shining lights that this is the company that opens tomorrow night? I am in the right theater, am I not? This is the Pretty Lady Company, isn't it? The all-star show that opens in Philadelphia tomorrow night? Quiet! Quiet!
Philadelphia, PA. Yeah, and on Sundays it's PU.
Quiet! Quiet!
Julian, you mean Atlantic City, don't you?
I mean Philadelphia. Train leaves at 1 p.m., Penn Station. Full dress rehearsal, 4 o'clock, Arch Street Theatre.
But I don't want to go to Philadelphia.
Who does?
But why Philadelphia?
Well, when you become stage director, we'll open in your apartment if you say so. But right now, it's Philadelphia. You've got the call, reading the call.
Of all the cities in the United States, he would pick Philadelphia.
All right, now listen to me. We open the Walnut Street Theatre, Philadelphia, tomorrow night.
Isn't that delightful? I must admit I howl with laughter every time Baxter says, "Who does?" And I'm willing to bet a lot of you just did too. So let's unpack what's going on in this scene. Why is everyone so upset when the director announces they're going to Philly? What's wrong with Philadelphia on Sundays? What stunk about it so much that it was considered PU? And did Broadway shows really make it a practice to try out at our old friend, the Art Street Theatre, which had been hosting plays, including those of another old friend, Mrs. Louisa Lane Drew, since the 1820s? What the heck was trying out? What was a Tryout Town, anyway? Why was the company of Pretty Lady going to one at all? We have here, after all, a fully produced show and a completely rehearsed Broadway company in New York City. They're literally in a Broadway theater right at the moment that scene is happening. Why are they going anywhere, let alone Philadelphia? So many questions. We're going to answer them all, one by one, in reverse order. Therefore, let's take the last question first. Why was the company of Pretty Lady leaving town to present their play in another city before staging it in New York? Well, for those of you who are longtime and faithful listeners to this podcast, I point you back to our episode 20, when we discussed the career of Louisa Lane Drew, the Duchess of the Art Street Theatre. You may remember that by the 1870s, Mrs. Drew had largely disbanded her old Philadelphia stock company of players because now the overwhelming trend in American theater was combination companies. Big single-show productions that traveled to almost every city in the country, stopping in local theaters in each town that they had booked along the way. Well, almost all of these combination companies came out of New York City, which by that point in time was the overwhelming leader in artistic taste and commercial power in the theatrical life of the nation. Now, admittedly, there were a few combinations that started in Chicago and Boston, but overwhelmingly, most of them started in New York. Almost no combination shows came out of Philadelphia, not anymore. And if they did, well, they might have a minor success in cities like Buffalo or Cleveland or Pittsburgh, but they would literally get laughed right out of New York by Gotham newspaper critics if they dared to come that way. Mrs. Drew may once have been a standard of quality for Philadelphia theater, but no more. That life was gone. In fact, Philly theater managers were desperate for touring New York shows to come down to them by the 1880s and the 1890s. And almost every show that came through Philadelphia at all, in its many professional houses in the late 19th century, as we detailed in our episode 30, The Best of Times, came out of New York. Philadelphia audiences, and audiences almost everywhere else in America then, felt reassured if a show came from New York, if it had met the test of Manhattan tastemakers, because then, well, it was worth spending your money and time on. Now, some of these shows had, in fact, first been seen in other cities, including Philadelphia, in their earliest incarnations, but they then had to go through New York to get that boost for the longer tour. Even our somewhat dubious hero, John A. Arnault, from episodes 28 and 29, known as the Black Booth, was able to attract a large audiences in Philadelphia's black community at the Academy of Music in 1887 because he had previously performed the role of Richard III in New York. That was his stamp of success. By the 1890s, Philadelphia stages were awash with touring New York plays and musicals and shows, and even international stars from England and France. The ease of transportation on America's huge railway network made all this possible. In fact, most shows made most of their money on the road, not in New York. And everyone from Edwin Booth to Sarah Bernhardt to Joseph Jefferson III were touring, constantly touring, going from one city to the next. And indeed, it was regarded as the true test of an actor's ability to sustain a performance, to meet the crowds in all of these varied cities and bring them pleasure and delight. In some ways, it was harder. There was a saying in theater that you can get away with murder in New York, but on the road, they find you out. Now, quite often, shows would be given a trial run outside of New York. As early as 1862, Augustine Daly's play Leah the Forsaken had an opening run at the Howard Athenaeum in Boston, and in 1877, a show called Ah Sin by Bret Hart and Mark Twain opened first at the National Theatre in Washington, D.C., before going on to Daly's Fifth Avenue Theatre in New York. But trial performances, as they called them, were rare before 1890, when the producer Charles Frohman began to employ them regularly with his shows like The Heart of Maryland, which played both Washington and Baltimore before going to New York. Charles Hoyt's show, which was called literally A Day and Night in New York, it was a behind-the-scenes drama whose action, like the later 42nd Street, was set in a New York theater. Well, that show came to Philadelphia's Chestnut Street Theatre in 1898, before moving on to the actual New York. But things would really change as we take this story into the very early 20th century. Now, you'll also remember back to our episode 43. And we talked about the theatrical syndicate, that combination of New York, Philadelphia, and West Coast theater owners who had supposedly rationalized the entire theatrical marketplace throughout the nation, who had literally cornered the market on national theater bookings, making sure that no combination company could be left without a booking somewhere on every night they possibly could, and also, of course, blackballing any independent producer who bucked their control because they took a huge cut out of everybody's paycheck. Why, heck, even the infamous and odious play The Klansman, whose story we told in episodes 42, 43, and 45, was a good example of this phenomenon. From 1906 on, it started in New York and attracted a lot of publicity, some of it very negative publicity, but all of it driving ticket sales, and then it sent out 2 touring companies, each with that New York imprimatur as it went from cities in the Northeast to those of the Deep South. So, there it is. Almost every production in America tended to travel, and indeed it was a rare commercial show that could be seen only in New York, no matter how technically complex it was and how daunting it would be to transport it from place to place. Moving shows around the country back then was an industry all its own. In fact, there were dozens of theatrical transfer companies whose special and particular business was the shipping and transportation of sets, costumes, and equipment from city to city. There were warehouses in almost every major town filled with theatrical equipment from various shows, either about to go somewhere or on their way to somewhere else. By October of the year 1900, huge productions like Ben-Hur, the massive staging of General Lew Wallace's novel, came down from New York to Philadelphia's Chestnut Street Opera House with a cast of 350 people, or so the producers claimed, and all their costumes and all their sets and all its stage machinery that would provide Philadelphia with a chance to see this spectacular show. The advertisements for this show advised the theater-going public that the 3.5-hour-long spectacle had strict requirements. The curtain will rise precisely at 8 o'clock in the evening and at 2 o'clock in the matinees, as it is necessary to darken the entire auditorium during the prelude, showing the beautiful Star of Bethlehem and Wise Men of the East. It is respectfully requested that patrons may be seated before the hours mentioned. But, if you had come late, there was more to see. There were 17 spectacular settings in this epic drama, set, like the novel it was based on, in Judea in biblical times, because this was Philadelphia, with its well-known cadre of powerful Protestant ministers who objected to any depictions of Jesus on the stage. Remember Sarah Bernhardt? So there was a particular disclaimer in these ads. Quote, there being considerable reference to religious matters in the book, great care has been taken in the dramatization to exclude from the play any religious incidents which, if placed on the stage, might give offense. In the miracle of the cleansing of the lepers, the presence of the Savior is only represented by a shaft of light. That's what the play's publicists assured us. Anyway, it was all to be capped, of course, by a chariot race. And again, there were real horses which were loaded on and off the trains as it stopped in city. And these horses seemed to run right out at the audience. There was a huge treadmill set in the stage. Though the illusion of their headlong dash is intensified by a moving panorama, reported the Philadelphia Times, which makes the horses appear to be going forward, though they are really always galloping over the same space. Buy your tickets now, advised the Times. Ben-Hur's stay in this city is limited. Because, it had other cities to get to. Theaters in Boston and Chicago and Minneapolis and San Francisco and Buffalo and everywhere else were waiting for their chance. But that's something else than what we've been talking about already, because Ben-Hur and the Klansmen and all the hundreds of other big commercial productions had started in New York. Increasingly, however, they were staying longer and longer in New York, not just running several weeks to get that New York shine, but they were getting enough audiences in New York to play for months, maybe even a whole theatrical season, 6, 7, 8 months, maybe into the next theatrical season. Well, the financial rewards of having a big show in the biggest theatrical marketplace were boggling, and the stakes began to become so high that each show's backers needed to know if these shows were good enough commercial propositions to begin with right at the start. Because, of course, there were hundreds of shows that flopped and got found out once they went out on the road. So the New York producers, right about at this time, about 1900, began to consider, what if, to be sure that we had a good thing to invest our time and money in, the right script, the right stars, the right dances, the best songs, a story everyone could follow, what if we gave it a bit of a, not just a trial, but a tryout? Let's give it a tryout. Well, what's a tryout? According to the Oxford English Dictionary, that great authority on the English language and its etymology, tryout was a word that had migrated over to show business from the sports world, meaning a test of performance, a trial run or period, specifically, says the OED, of a play, etc., in a provincial theater, etc. Listen to that, provincial, so someplace outside of the capital. Baseball players and rowers and cricketers previously might have been given a tryout on athletic teams, both in England and America, but at this point, says the OED, the first time tryout was used in a theatrical sense was in 1923, when the New York Times referred to it as, quote, an experimental hearing of a new act, usually far away from Broadway. Now, notice they don't say a new play, they say a new act, which implies that the New York Times in this article is referring to vaudeville, a topic we're going to talk about in our next episode. But I'm afraid the fellows at the OED just are a little behind the curve of theater history there, because just by going on Google Ngrams quickly, I can learn that in the year 1918, the theater historian Arthur Hornblow was using the term Tryout Town already. So 5 years before you, OED, I've got a previous reference. And this use of the term tryout was in reference to the city of Chicago. To wit, there is only a very small coterie of first-nighters in Chicago who are very suspicious of every new play and are inclined to resent the fact that Chicago is used as a tryout town. And Hornblow doesn't even put that phrase, tryout town, in quotation marks, so it's obviously something he was quite familiar with saying, and everyone else would have known what he was talking about. So, what is a tryout town? Although it's pretty self-explanatory, and it's a bit of a disparaging term, really. It means any city with a large theater outside of New York where producers could send their shows to see if it was good enough and to do a little shakedown cruise, as it were. Now, actually, big cities like Philadelphia and Chicago weren't always the best choice for tryouts because all the local theatergoers considered themselves sophisticated. They didn't like to be treated like test markets. They wanted to see the real quality thing. If it's good enough, send it to us. Don't give us a mediocre product. And anyway, in big cities, it was too easy for word to quickly get back to New York and to showbiz gossip circles if things weren't going well at first. So what you were looking for, if you're a New York producer, was what was called in vaudeville lingo a dog town, a quiet, small city where dogs might lie down peacefully in the streets and no one would disturb them. Places that were close enough to New York, like Hartford or Stamford or New Haven in Connecticut, Newark or Trenton in New Jersey, Springfield, Massachusetts, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, heck, even Yonkers or Albany or Brooklyn in New York. And then these dog towns could become tryout towns. So they took the word tryout and then they merged it onto this phrase dog towns. And now you've got tryout towns, where local theatergoers could view each show that came through, no matter how new and unfinished it was, as a treat. It was a treat to see a fresh new production long before it got to the big theaters or close to the Manhattan street called Broadway. Now, you might remember that on Broadway, there's a statue depicting a guy named George M. Cohan. On October 19th, 1904, George M. Cohan's new show, entitled Little Johnny Jones, opened at the Walnut Street Theatre in Philadelphia. It had previously played brief engagements in Hartford, New Haven, and Springfield, Massachusetts. And after Philly, it was going to take a brief stop in Harrisburg. But then it was definitely on its way to New York, where it was already booked to open at the Liberty Theater in early November. Little Johnny Jones was Cohan's first star production, the one in which he both created and starred in the show under his own name. Cohan had literally grown up in his family's vaudeville act, along with his parents and his sister. They were billed jointly as the Four Cohans, and his 1901 show, The Governor's Son, which had featured them as the Four Cohans, had also come through the Walnut back in April of 1901, but in a post-Broadway tour. Early in 1904, however, it seems there'd been some sort of quarrel amongst the Four Cohans because showbiz gossip said that the act was breaking up. But apparently the Cohans had patched things together again, and George's parents and his sister were all given small parts in Little Johnny Jones, but the star of the show was definitely George. So this 1904 production of Little Johnny Jones, you might know it. It's famous in theater history for being one of the first musicals with an actual plot, stitching together its various songs. That was a fairly revolutionary thing. It included the now famous Cohan songs, Give My Regards to Broadway, which wasn't about Broadway theaters, but about the sort of nightlife and fun crowd that hung around bars and saloons and night spots on Broadway back in the 1890s. And it also had, of course, Yankee Doodle Dandy, that patriotic number. If you're familiar with both of those songs, it's probably because you've seen James Cagney dancing and singing in both of them in the 1942 Hollywood biopic of Cohan called Yankee Doodle Dandy. Now, as with many supposed game changers in the development of the American musical, few people took much notice of them at the time. And this production in 1904 only got cursory attention in the Philly newspapers. After all, there were plenty of other fun shows happening in Philadelphia that day, including David Belasco's Sweet Kitty Bellairs, which was playing at the Academy of Music, and Fritzi Sheff in the operetta The Two Roses at the Chestnut Street Opera House. Cohan's Little Johnny Jones got quick mention in the Inquirer as a delightful evening's entertainment, but that was about it. And back then, almost every musical show or review that came through town got praised. Serious theater criticism, if it happened at all, was reserved for actual plays, straight plays. Newspapers mostly just printed any publicist's copy that they were handed about musicals, and it was always wonderful, amazing, delightful, charming. And of course, Savvy producers had often hired journalists to be their local advance men. A little extra salary there, and that would ensure good coverage for their show when it came through town. And after just 2 weeks at the Walnut, George Cohan moved Little Johnny Jones on to Harrisburg and then New York. And then the show played just a few months. Not a long run. And then it went out again on tour once more. That was normal for those times. In fact, by April of 1905, Little Johnny Jones was back again in Philadelphia, and this time at the larger and more lucrative Chestnut Street Theatre. Not the Opera House, but the theater. For Philadelphia, the Chestnut Street Theatre was closer to Broad Street, if not Broadway. All right, so remember, we have an overall task. We're still rolling back through that long list of questions I asked back at the beginning. Speaking of Philadelphia streets and the theaters in Philadelphia that were often named after those streets, what about the Arch Street Theatre, which Julian Marsh tells the cast of Pretty Lady that they're going to? They're going to the Arch Street Theatre, he says, and stomps off. Well, I gotta say, that wasn't a thing. No big new musicals were coming from New York and rolling on to the Arch Street Theatre in the 1920s and 30s, either before or after Broadway. By this time, the dear old Arch, the long-time home theater of the Drews, and by inheritance, the Barrymores, was over 100 years old, and it was a little dowdy. It was a very old-fashioned Victorian-style house with cast-iron pillars holding up its balconies, blocking folks' view, and a pretty limited backstage area. And it was in a very unfashionable and somewhat unpleasant part of town, too. This was nowhere near the glittering theaters of Broad Street, like the Forest or the Schubert or the Lyric. The Arch Street Theatre was, in fact, now in the middle of the Tenderloin neighborhood in Philadelphia, which was full of bars and bordellos and drug dens and theatrical flop houses. The Arch was more often the home of Yiddish theater than English language drama in that time. And when it wasn't hosting Yiddish drama, it was hosting burlesque and low vaudeville. And by 1936, in the depths of the Depression, it was sold by its owners and torn down to make room for a parking lot. So, no, the reference to the Arch Street Theatre in the movie is just tin-eared in terms of actual Philadelphia theater history. And whatever Hollywood screenwriter typed that line was operating off some bad information. I can imagine him calling out to his writing partner as they pound away on their typewriters in some bungalow in California. Hey, buddy, what's the name of a theater in Philly? Well, I don't know, replies his partner. But then he remembers something he half heard once about Ethel Barrymore. Hey, what about the Arch Street Theatre? That's in Philly. Okay, said the first guy, and it goes into the script. And he remembers that old showbiz crack about Philadelphia being a politically corrupt and socially dull town. One where, due to its restrictive blue laws, you can't even get a drink or go to a movie or a baseball game on Sundays.
Philadelphia, PA. Yeah, and on Sundays it's PU.
And then, you remember, after that remark comes this next crack from the leading lady of the company, pleading with her director. She doesn't want to go to a strange place like dirty old corrupt Philadelphia PU. She wants to go somewhere easy and fun and breezy and less threatening to her career prospects should things go wrong. She says,
Julian, you mean Atlantic City, don't you?
Atlantic City, which is 60 miles southeast of Philadelphia, on the beautiful Atlantic shore, because it turns out, ladies and gentlemen, and believe you me, I only just found this out myself, to show folks of the early 20th century the most well-known and familiar dog town in the country. In fact, the premier tryout town in America was not Philadelphia, but instead the seaside resort where so many Philadelphians spent their summer months back in those days, Atlantic City, New Jersey.
Should drop around, won't you please tell them that we can be found on the boardwalk in Atlantic City? We will walk in a dream on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. life will be peaches and cream.
I have here in my hand, ladies and gentlemen, an amazing document. It is a doctoral dissertation entitled Atlantic City as a Tryout Town. You should have heard the whoop I let out when I found this. It was submitted in 1973 by the scholar Constance Barry Martin to the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana in completion of her PhD. Professor Martin got her undergraduate degree, by the way, from Rutgers University in New Jersey in the year 1960. And before that, she had grown up, as it turns out, in Atlantic City. So, Dr. Martin, as she became after this dissertation was accepted, was the perfect person for the task at hand. Her dissertation begins. From 1900 to 1935, approximately 1,100 plays tried out on Atlantic City stages before their scheduled opening in New York City. Some of these productions never reached New York. Others played hundreds of performances, both in New York and on tour in all parts of the country. During these years, the resort became the foremost tryout town in the East, and the response of Atlantic City audiences to his show was regarded as indicative of how New York audiences would receive it. On the strength of the reaction in Atlantic City, plays were altered, actors replaced, or whole productions shelved. Now, from Dr. Martin's exhaustive study of newspapers and journals of this bygone era, she reported, quote, "It was difficult to determine when the tryout first appeared in Atlantic City, but the 1900-1901 season seemed to mark their beginning. The number reached a peak in the 1909-1910 season, and a second higher peak occurred in the 1919-1920 season, and then declined and came to an end in the 1934-35 season." Close quotes. Now, during that period, according to the doctor, Atlantic City had 4 distinct advantages over other towns like Philly and Boston and Washington, D.C. 1, it was within a day's travel of New York, and 2, it could be easily reached by some form of transportation, which meant trucks or, even better, trains. In fact, some of the fastest locomotives in the world operated at that time between New York City and Atlantic City, so that people could get quickly down to their coast for their vacations. So, check and check. And third, she said, a tryout town needed to have a theater-going population large enough to fill the house for several performances at least, and preferably to give an educated and cosmopolitan reaction to what they saw. While the population of Atlantic City was only about 27,000, 30,000 people year-round, but during the summer months, it swelled to twice that, 3 times that, as its huge hotels and resort areas filled with city people, many of them from Philadelphia, whose rail connections to Atlantic City were much shorter and quicker. Indeed, for years, Philadelphians had been accustomed to taking day trips by boat to Atlantic City during the summer months. Or, if you were a person of means, you might stay a month, maybe 2. Number 4, the fourth thing that a tryout town needed, says Dr. Martin, were theaters, or that were sufficiently large in terms of audience and equipped to serve the needs of a complex theatrical production. And in fact, by 1898, Atlantic City had its own new Academy of Music, where the production, Her Majesty, the Girl Queen of Nordenmark, had a tryout run in May of 1900. Now, this show, Her Majesty, the Girl Queen of Nordenmark, did not receive good notices when it got into New York. So you think, well, that obviously didn't work, but the producers liked the experience that they'd had there. That worked well. So in January of 1901, Captain Jinks of the Horse Marines, starring a young Ethel Barrymore, came through Atlantic City. After, first, by the way, playing the Walnut Street Theatre in Philadelphia. You'll remember that. We told a story about someone in the crowd yelling at Ethel to speak up. All the Drews are good actors. So we can see that sometimes Philly did get the first crack at a production. But on the whole, Atlantic City began to attract more and more of these shows and got them first. And more theaters were built there to accommodate this trend. Sometimes right on the piers, you could hear waves crashing beneath you as the shows went on. A new theater built on the shore, the Savoy, that seated 1,200 people, quickly became the premier Atlantic City theater. Later, something called the Apollo Theater joined it. And soon the Philadelphia Syndicate moved in. Samuel F. Nixon was sniffing around, hoping to build or acquire venues there. Soon the Syndicate's great rivals, the Shuberts, were in Atlantic City as well, and they snapped up the Savoy from under Nixon's nose. And by the year 1910, as Martin tells us, things were really buzzing. And people began to come to Atlantic City just to catch the tryout shows. It became a thing. Quote, the opportunity to see new productions, plus the showmen and stars who put them on, attracted not only the tourists, but the theater people as well. Thus, the city flourished also as a theatrical resort because it was close to the theatrical centers of New York and Philadelphia and provided many types of entertainment and afforded showfolk the chance of meeting friends. Got to bring this story back to Philadelphia. It's right there in the title of our podcast. So how did shows like the fictional Pretty Lady start having their tryouts in Philadelphia instead of Atlantic City? Well, that's exactly what we plan to talk about in our episodes this entire season. We will be exploring the main story of Philadelphia theater from the years 1918 to 1982, when, at least in terms of show business, it was widely understood that Philadelphia was a tryout town, one of the main tryout towns in the country, maybe the principal tryout town. You remember that song?
Another opening, another show in Philly, Boston, or Baltimore. A chance for stage folks to say hello. Another opening of another.
Everyone's been singing that song to me ever since I announced this season. And of course, Kiss Me Kate had its pre-Broadway tryout in Philadelphia in December of 1948 at the Shubert Theater. But before we talk about that, we need to talk about the other major form of live show business, one that seemed at times destined to overwhelm both the legitimate theater and grand opera in popularity during its heyday, vaudeville. We will pick up the story right there next time. What was going on in vaudeville, and how does that affect Philadelphia as a tryout town? We'll cover that first, and then we'll go on from there. It's going to be an exciting season of episodes. Guys and Dolls, Death of a Salesman, Diary of Anne Frank, Strike Up the Band, but there are lots and lots more shows that tried out in Philadelphia that you haven't heard of because they flopped in Philly and didn't get anywhere else. But these make great stories too. Possibly even better stories than the successes. Anyway, so we'll be back again here soon on this podcast feed. I'm Peter Schmitz. Our original theme music is by Christopher Mark Colucci. The sound editing and engineering, this time around anyway, was by my humble self. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. And thank you for coming along on another adventure in theater history, Philadelphia.